Welcome back. If you're here for the first time, welcome. And if you've been with us before, it's good to have you again. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It's a small gesture, but it means everything. It tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters, and it helps us reach more people who are looking for something thoughtful, something calm, something worth their time. Now settle in. Find a comfortable position. You are about to embark on a journey through one of the oldest and most layered civilizations in human history. A land of mountain ranges and desert plains, of poets and conquerors, of fire temples and royal gardens. A country that shaped the ancient world and still holds its echoes today. This is the history of Iran. And there's something remarkable waiting at the end of this story, something that almost no one talks about when they mention this country. So stay with us. Chapter 1. The Land Before Memory. Before the empires, before the kings and their inscriptions, before any name was ever written down, there are people here. The Iranian plateau is one of those rare places on Earth where the conditions for human life came together almost perfectly. Flanked by mountain ranges on two sides, it offered shelter. Its rivers fed early settlements. Its soil held grain, and its position, sitting at the crossroads between Central Asia, Mesopotamia, and the Indian subcontinent, made it a natural gathering point for human movement. Archaeological evidence tells us that humans have lived on this plateau for at least 100,000 years. But the story begins to sharpen around 10,000 years ago, when the last ice age loosened its grip on the world and people began to do something new, to stay in one place. One of the earliest known Neolithic villages in the world was discovered in western Iran, in a place called Ganjder. Here, around 9,000 years ago, people were domesticating goats, growing grain, building mud brick structures, living in communities small enough to know everyone's name, but organized enough to begin the slow process of civilization. Then came Susa. By around 4000 BCE, Susa had grown into one of the most significant cities in the ancient Near East. Its potters produced ceramics of extraordinary refinement. Its trade networks stretched across hundreds of miles. And within its boundaries, a culture was forming, the Elamite civilization, that would persist for thousands of years and leave its mark on everything that came after. The Elamites are one of history's quiet giants. Often overlooked in favor of their neighbors in Mesopotamia, they built a complex society with its own writing system, its own art, and its own relationship with the divine. They traded with Sumerians. They went to war with Babylonians. They endured, adapted, and returned again and again, over 3 millennia. And somewhere in those millennia, the people who would change everything began to arrive. The Indo-Iranian tribes, distant ancestors of modern Iranians, migrated from the steppes of Central Asia sometime around 2000 BCE. They brought with them horses, a religion centered on fire and cosmic order, and a language that would eventually become Persian. They didn't conquer the plateau all at once. They filtered in, settled, intermarried, and gradually became something new. Two groups in particular took shape in the northwest. The Medes settled near what is today Hamadan. The Persians moved south toward the region they would call Persia, Pars, or Fars. By the 8th century BCE, these two peoples were vassals of the powerful Assyrian Empire. They paid tribute. They sent soldiers. They bided their time. Their time was coming. Chapter 2: The Median Empire and the Fall of Assyria. In the ancient world, few empires inspired more fear than Assyria. Their armies were ruthless and methodical. Their kings recorded their conquests in brutal detail on stone reliefs, depicting sieges, deportations, the systematic destruction of cities. For 2 centuries, they had dominated the Near East with an iron grip. The Medes watched and learned. Around 678 BCE, a Median chieftain named Deoses, or Deaku in Persian records, began uniting the scattered Median tribes under a single rule. Ancient sources describe him as a man of unusual intelligence, someone who used his reputation for fairness and judgment to draw people toward him before consolidating power. He built a capital at Ecbatana in the mountains of western Iran, a city said to have 7 concentric walls, each painted a different color. His successors expanded Median territory steadily, but it was under Cyaxares, around 615 BCE, that the Medes made their decisive move. In alliance with the Babylonians to the south, Cyaxares marched against the Assyrian heartland. The siege of Nineveh in 612 BCE was one of the defining moments of the ancient world. The city that had seemed unconquerable, the city whose fall the prophet Nahum had dreamed of, was brought down in 3 months. Nineveh burned. The Assyrian Empire, which had towered over the Near East for centuries, collapsed with startling speed. The Medes suddenly found themselves rulers of a vast territory, stretching from what is now eastern Turkey to the borders of Central Asia. They had become a great power almost overnight. But the Median Empire, for all its sudden greatness, would not last long. Within 3 generations, it would be swept away, not by an outside conqueror, but by a vassal from within. A Persian king from the south, a man whose name would echo across 25 centuries. Chapter 3: Cyrus the Great and the Birth of the Achaemenid Empire. His name was Cyrus, and what makes him extraordinary is not simply what he built, but how he built it. In 559 BCE, Cyrus became king of the small Persian kingdom of Anshan, a vassal state under Median rule. He was perhaps 30 years old. His kingdom was modest. His ambitions were not. Within a decade, he had overthrown the Median king Astyages, his own grandfather, according to some traditions, and absorbed the Median Empire into what would become the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The transition was remarkably peaceful. Cyrus kept Median nobles in his court, retained their administrative systems, and honored their traditions. This would become his signature approach. Then came Lydia. Croesus, the king of Lydia in western Anatolia, was one of the wealthiest men in the ancient world. His name has become a byword for wealth that survives even today. We still say rich as Croesus. He consulted the oracle at Delphi before marching against Cyrus and received the famous reply: if he crossed the Halys River to attack Persia, a great empire would fall. He crossed. The empire that fell was his own. By 547 BCE, Lydia was Persian territory. By 539 BCE, Cyrus marched into Babylon, the greatest city of the ancient world. And here is where history becomes genuinely astonishing. Cyrus did not sack Babylon. He entered the city without a battle, welcomed, according to Babylonian records, as a liberator. He restored temples that a previous king had closed. He allowed the deportees of Babylon, including the Jewish exiles taken by Nebuchadnezzar, to return to their homelands. He declared, in what is often called the world's first human rights charter, the Cyrus Cylinder, that people would be free to worship their own gods and live according to their own customs. Whether or not the Cyrus Cylinder represents a genuine philosophical commitment to tolerance or a sophisticated political strategy, or both, its existence tells us something remarkable about how power was exercised in Achaemenid Persia. The empire did not require uniformity. It required loyalty and tribute. Beyond that, peoples kept their customs, their languages, their gods. Cyrus died in 530 BCE on campaign in the east. Ancient sources disagree on the exact circumstances. He was buried at Pasargadae in a simple stone tomb that still stands today. Alexander the Great, who visited the tomb nearly 2 centuries later, was said to have been moved by the inscription it bore, a reminder that the greatest of rulers is, in the end, only dust. His successors, Cambyses II and then Darius I, would push the empire further still. Under Darius I, the Achaemenid Empire reached its greatest extent, from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, from the Caucasus in the north to Egypt and Libya in the south. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Darius built Persepolis, a ceremonial capital of extraordinary beauty, where representatives of all the subject nations came to pay tribute at the Persian New Year. The carvings that survive show Egyptians and Ethiopians, Indians and Lydians, Greeks and Scythians, a deliberate portrait of a world held together under Persian rule. He also divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a term still used today for local rulers who answer to a distant power. He standardized coinage, built roads, created one of the ancient world's most efficient postal systems. And then came the Greeks, and everything began to change. Chapter 4: The Persian Wars and the Greek Encounter. The Persian Wars are one of the most famous conflicts in history, but almost entirely from one perspective: the Greek perspective. The Persian side of the story is quieter, buried under centuries of Western narrative. From the Persian point of view, the Greek city-states of Ionia, on the western coast of Anatolia, were simply part of the empire. When they rebelled in 499 BCE, aided by Athens, Darius responded as any ruler would. He crushed the rebellion and then turned his attention to the states that had helped it. The expedition against Greece in 490 BCE was not, from Darius's perspective, a grand clash of civilizations. It was a punitive expedition against a small, peripheral region that had interfered in imperial affairs. The defeat at Marathon, where the Athenians won a stunning victory against the Persian landing force, was a setback, not a catastrophe. Darius died before he could respond. His son Xerxes took up the campaign. In 480 BCE, Xerxes assembled the largest army the ancient world had seen. Estimates range from 200,000 to over 1 million men, though modern historians lean toward the lower end. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont. He marched into Greece. The story of Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans holding the narrow pass against the Persian host, has become one of the great myths of Western civilization. And it was indeed an extraordinary act of courage. But it was also a tactical delay, not a decisive battle. The Persians went around. They took Athens. They burned the Acropolis. What stopped them was the sea. At Salamis, the Greek fleet, smaller, more maneuverable, caught the Persian navy in a narrow strait and shattered it. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore as his ships were destroyed. He withdrew his fleet. Without naval supply lines, his army could not be sustained indefinitely. The campaign wound down. The Persian Wars ended without a decisive resolution. Greece was not conquered, but Persia was not destroyed either. The empire continued for another century and a half, prosperous, vast, and stable. And in the courts of Persepolis, life went on. Poetry was composed. Trade flourished. Satraps governed. The world's largest empire hummed along, largely indifferent to the defeats that Greek historians would remember for millennia. Chapter 5: Alexander and the End of the Achaemenids. In 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king crossed into Anatolia with an army of roughly 40,000 men and a library full of ambition. Alexander of Macedon, who would become Alexander the Great, had been raised on tales of the Persian Wars. He saw himself as the avenger of Greece, come to repay what Xerxes had done to Athens a century and a half before. But as he moved east through the empire, something unexpected happened. He became fascinated by what he found. The Persian Empire fell in stages. The battles of Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela dismantled Persian military power. Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, was a capable ruler who faced an opponent of almost supernatural military genius. He fled twice from battle before being murdered by his own men in 330 BCE. Alexander reached Persepolis and burned part of it, reportedly at the urging of a drunken Athenian courtesan, though this may be legend. But he also ordered the preservation of much of the city. He dressed in Persian robes. He adopted Persian court ceremony. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian noble women, as he himself did, taking Roxana of Bactria as his first wife and Statira, daughter of Darius, as another. This blending of Greek and Persian culture would create something new, a fusion that scholars call Hellenism, which would influence art, philosophy, and architecture across the ancient world for centuries. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, 32 years old, of uncertain causes. His empire immediately fractured among his generals. The eastern portion, including Persia, eventually fell to Seleucus I, whose dynasty would rule for nearly 2 centuries. But beneath the Greek surface, the Persian identity endured, and a new Iranian dynasty was already forming in the northeast. Chapter 6: The Parthians and the Resilience of Iran. The Parthians came from the northeastern edge of the Iranian plateau, from a region called Parthia, east of the Caspian Sea. They were at first semi-nomadic people who had been part of the Seleucid Empire. But in 247 BCE, under a leader named Arsaces, they declared independence. The Arsaces dynasty they founded would rule Iran for nearly 5 centuries, longer than the Achaemenids. Their empire at its height stretched from the Euphrates to eastern Iran, making them the dominant power between Rome and China. The Parthians were pragmatic rulers. They blended Iranian traditions with a Greek administrative and cultural legacy left by Alexander. They used Greek as an official language while also maintaining Persian customs. They presented themselves to Western subjects as Hellenistic kings and to Eastern subjects as Iranian monarchs. This flexibility was one of their greatest strengths. Their military strength was legendary. Parthian cavalry, heavy armored lancers called cataphracts, and skilled mounted archers who could shoot backwards while retreating, the famous Parthian shot, confounded Roman legions repeatedly. In 53 BCE, at the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians destroyed a Roman army under Marcus Crassus. one of Rome's wealthiest men and a member of the ruling triumvirate. Crassus was killed. Tens of thousands of Roman legionaries were captured. Rome never fully recovered the standards it lost that day. For 2 centuries, Parthia and Rome existed in a state of Cold War, occasional hot conflict, and uneasy diplomacy. Neither could destroy the other. The frontier between them, roughly following the Euphrates River, became one of the most contested borders in the ancient world. But the Parthian Empire had a structural weakness. It was a federation of powerful regional lords who sometimes rivaled the central power. By the early 3rd century CE, that weakness had become fatal. A regional governor from Pars, the original Persian homeland, led a rebellion. His name was Ardashir. Chapter 7, the Sassanid Empire, Iran's second golden age. Ardashir I defeated the last Parthian king in 224 CE and founded the Sassanid dynasty, a dynasty that would consciously invoke the memory of the Achaemenids, claimed to be the true heirs of ancient Persia, and rule for over 4 centuries. The Sassanid Empire was, in many ways, the most culturally coherent Iranian state before the modern era. Where the Parthians had been comfortable with Greek influence, the Sassanids deliberately Persianized everything. The official language became Middle Persian, a direct ancestor of modern Farsi. The official religion became Zoroastrianism, centered on fire temples maintained across the empire. Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, or near-monotheistic, with its cosmic dualism between the god of truth, Ahura Mazda, and the destructive spirit Ahriman. Founded by the prophet Zoroaster, possibly as early as 1500 BCE, though the dates remain debated, it profoundly influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Concepts like heaven and hell, the final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, many of these have roots in Zoroastrian thought. Under the Sassanids, Zoroastrianism received state support. Fire temples burned in every province. The Avesta, the collection of Zoroastrian sacred texts, was compiled and standardized. The priestly class, the Magi, played an important role in court life. But the Sassanids were also remarkably cosmopolitan in practice. Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Jews, and Manichaeans all lived within the empire's borders. The Great Academy of Gandhishapur in southwestern Iran became one of the ancient world's premier centers of learning, where Greek, Persian, and Indian medical and philosophical traditions met and combined. Militarily, the Sassanids resumed the great Western rivalry, but now with Rome and later with Byzantium. The wars were extraordinary in their scale and duration. Shapur I, one of the greatest Sassanid kings, defeated 3 Roman emperors. He captured Valerian in 260 CE, making him the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner in battle. The rock carvings at Nakshi Rostam in Iran still show Valerian kneeling before Shapur on horseback. The 6th century brought another peak. Khosrow I, known as Anushirvan, the immortal soul, reformed taxation, reorganized the military, and presided over a cultural flourishing that later Iranian tradition would remember as a golden age. During his reign, Indian chess was introduced to Iran and transformed into the game we recognize today. Greek philosophical texts were translated into Persian. The empire reached from Yemen to Central Asia. And then, with startling speed, everything changed again. Chapter 8, the Arab Conquest and the Coming of Islam. In 632 CE, the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina. The Arabian Peninsula had been transformed. Within a decade, The armies of the new Islamic faith would change the world. The Sassanid Empire, weakened by decades of devastating war with Byzantium and torn by internal political instability, 20 emperors in the last century, was not in a position to resist what came next. The Arab Muslim armies moved with extraordinary speed. In 636 CE, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the Sassanid army was defeated on the plains of Mesopotamia. The capital Ctesiphon fell. The last Sassanid emperor, Yazdijerd III, fled east across Iran, seeking support that never came. He was killed in 651 CE, murdered by a miller near the city of Merv in Central Asia, an inglorious end to one of history's greatest dynasties. Iran became part of the Umayyad Caliphate, and then the Abbasid Caliphate. The Arabic language arrived. Islam spread, sometimes by persuasion, sometimes by the calculation of converts who saw advantage in the new order. Over the following 2 centuries, the majority of Iranians became Muslim. But something remarkable happened, which separates Iran from almost every other land that the Arab conquest reached. Iran kept its language. Egypt became Arabic-speaking. Syria became Arabic-speaking. Iraq, the Levant, North Africa, all eventually adopted Arabic as their primary tongue. But Iran, while absorbing Arabic script and vocabulary, held on to Persian. The language evolved, becoming New Persian, Farsi, but the continuity never broke. Iranians remained Iranian in a way that was culturally distinct, even as they embraced Islam with deep sincerity. In fact, Iranians would transform Islam from within. The great scholars, scientists, and philosophers of the Islamic Golden Age were disproportionately of Iranian origin. Al-Biruni, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, Al-Razi, Al-Farabi. They wrote in Arabic, but many thought in Persian. The empire of the mind was as much Iranian as it was Arab. And in the 9th century, as the Abbasid Caliphate weakened, Iranian dynasties began to re-emerge. The Tahirids, the Saffarids, the Samanids, reasserting Persian cultural and political identity within an Islamic framework. It was under the Samanids in the 10th century that one of the greatest literary works in any language was composed. Chapter 9, The Shahnameh and the Persian Renaissance. Imagine spending 30 years of your life writing a single poem. Imagine that poem containing 60,000 verses. Imagine that it tells the entire history, mythical and historical, of your people from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest. And imagine doing all of this with the explicit purpose of saving your language from extinction. This is what Abolkasem Ferdowsi did. The Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, was completed around 1010 CE and is considered the greatest work of Persian literature. It is also one of the longest epic poems ever written by a single author. Its stories of the hero Rostam, of the tragic Sorab, of the mythical kings Jamshid and Feridun, are as familiar to Iranians today as Shakespeare is to English speakers. Perhaps more so, the Shahnameh did something no political force could have accomplished. It crystallized Persian identity through story. Long after kingdoms rose and fell, long after invaders came and went, the Shahnameh remained, a monument in language that told Iranians who they were. Ferdowsi wrote it partly as a critique of the ruling Ghaznavid Sultan, Mahmud, who he felt had not adequately honored Persian culture. The story goes that Mahmud promised payment in gold, but paid in silver. Ferdowsi, infuriated, wrote a satirical poem about him and died before receiving proper recognition. But this cultural renaissance was about more than literature. The 10th and 11th centuries saw Iranian mathematical, astronomical, medical, and philosophical scholarship reach heights that would not be surpassed in Europe for centuries. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine remained a standard medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. And then, from the east, came the storm. Chapter 10, The Mongol Catastrophe. In the early 13th century, Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes and set in motion a wave of conquest that would reshape Eurasia. What happened to Iran when the Mongols arrived is one of the most devastating episodes in human history. The first Mongol incursions in the 1220s were horrific. The city of Merv, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of learning with a population perhaps exceeding 1 million, was taken and destroyed. Survivors who emerged from hiding were systematically killed. The figure of 1 million dead at Merv alone appears in historical sources. Those scholars debate the precise numbers. Nishapur, Balkh, Herat, one by one, the great cities of the Persian-speaking world were put to the sword. The irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for millennia were deliberately destroyed. Entire regions depopulated and reverted to desert. A second wave came in 1258 when Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, sacked Baghdad, killing the last Abbasid caliph. The center of the Islamic world was obliterated. But history is rarely a simple story of destruction. Within 2 generations, the Mongol rulers of Iran, the Ilkhanate, had converted to Islam and become patrons of Persian culture. The Il Khans built mosques and commissioned manuscripts. Persian bureaucrats ran the empire. Iranian artists fused Mongol and Persian visual traditions into something new, a style that would influence Chinese painting, Mughal miniatures, and Ottoman illumination. Iran had been nearly destroyed, and then, quietly, it had absorbed its conquerors. Chapter 11, The Safavid Dynasty. Iran becomes Shia. In 1501, a 16-year-old boy with flame-red hair led an army into the city of Tabriz and declared himself Shah of Iran. His name was Ismail, founder of the Safavid dynasty, and his arrival would reshape the religious and political landscape of the Middle East in ways that still shape the world today. Ismail belonged to a Sufi religious order and claimed descent from the Shia Imams, the line of successors to the Prophet Muhammad recognized by Shia Muslims. He declared Twelver Shia Islam the official religion of Iran. This was not a minor theological adjustment. At the time, most of Iran's population was Sunni. Ismail enforced the conversion with considerable force. The consequences were enormous. To the west, the Ottoman Empire, champion of Sunni Islam, became Iran's great rival. The two powers would fight wars on and off for over 2 centuries. The boundary between them, roughly following the border between modern Iran and Turkey and Iraq, was shaped by these conflicts and remains roughly recognizable today. Shia Islam gradually became deeply rooted in Iranian identity. The mourning rituals for Hussein ibn Ali, the Prophet's grandson, killed at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, became central expressions of Iranian culture. The holiday of Ashura, with its processions and lamentation, became part of the rhythm of Iranian life. The Safavid era reached its cultural peak under Shah Abbas I, who came to the throne in 1588. He moved the capital to Isfahan, and then proceeded to make it one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Great Nakshi Jahan Square in Isfahan, one of the largest public squares ever built, was constructed during his reign. Around it rose the Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque, its interior tiled in patterns of such mathematical intricacy that they seem to shift and breathe as the light changes. The Ali Kapu Palace overlooked the polo grounds where a boss played with his courtiers. The bazaar stretched away into the city like a covered universe. An Italian traveler of the period wrote that Isfahan was half the world, and the Persian phrase Isfahan Nesfi Jahan, Isfahan is half the world, became a proverb that Iranians still use. The Safavid period produced extraordinary carpets, miniature paintings, metalwork, and poetry. But the dynasty also struggled with the same challenges that had plagued previous Iranian empires: the tension between central power and regional lords, and the perennial threat from the east. In 1722, an Afghan army took Isfahan. The Safavid dynasty effectively ended. Iran entered a period of instability that would last for decades. Chapter 12: Nader Shah and the Afsharid Interlude. Out of the chaos of the Safavid collapse rose one of history's most remarkable military commanders, a man of low birth who made himself master of an empire. Nader Koli Beg, later known as Nader Shah, was a Turkic tribesman from northeastern Iran who rose through military service to become the power behind a series of puppet rulers, before declaring himself Shah in 1736. He reconquered territories that had been lost during the instability of the previous decades. He drove the Ottomans back. He recovered the eastern provinces. His most audacious act was his invasion of Mughal India in 1738. The Mughal Empire, once the wealthiest state in the world, had grown weak and decadent under incompetent successors to Aurangzeb. Nader entered Delhi, and when an incident led to clashes between his troops and the city's inhabitants, he unleashed a massacre. From Delhi, Nader took treasures of incalculable value, including the Peacock Throne, symbol of Mughal power, and the Kohinoor diamond, which would eventually pass through Afghan and Sikh hands before ending up in the British crown jewels, where it remains today. Nader Shah was a military genius. He was also increasingly cruel and paranoid in his later years, blinding his own son on suspicion of conspiracy. He was assassinated by his own officers in 1747. His empire did not outlast him. What followed was another period of fragmentation, until a new dynasty emerged, not from the Persian heartland, but from the Qajar tribe of northern Iran. Chapter 13: The Qajar Dynasty and the Great Game. The Qajar Dynasty, which ruled Iran from 1796 to 1925, governed during one of the most difficult periods in Iranian history, an era when the great European powers were reshaping the world, and Iran found itself caught between two of the most aggressive. To the north, Russia was expanding steadily into the Caucasus and Central Asia. To the south and east, the British Empire, operating largely through its control of India, was extending its influence into Afghanistan and the Persian Gulf. Iran, weak, poorly organized, and financially strained, was trapped in the middle of what became known as the Great Game. The results were humiliating. Two wars with Russia, in 1804 and 1826, ended in the Treaty of Turkmenchay, through which Iran lost the territories of modern Azerbaijan and Armenia. The terms were harsh and included significant war reparations. A generation later, Britain forced further concessions regarding Afghanistan. The Qajar court was also often corrupt and isolated from the realities of a changing world. Concessions were granted to foreign powers, most notoriously the Reuter Concession of 1872, which gave a British subject near total control of Iranian economic development. The concession was so outrageous that even the British government was embarrassed, and it was eventually canceled. But within this external pressure, something important was happening internally. Iranians were developing new political ideas. An intellectual movement began questioning the nature of royal power, demanding constitutional limits on the Shah, and looking to European models of governance. In 1905, this movement crystallized into the Constitutional Revolution, one of the first democratic revolutions in Asia. Iranians forced the Shah to accept a constitution and establish a parliament, the Majlis. The revolution was messy, violent, and ultimately incomplete. Foreign interference and internal divisions prevented it from fully taking hold. But it planted seeds that would grow in the following century. Chapter 14, the Pahlavi Dynasty, Oil, Modernization, and Revolution. In 1921, a military officer named Reza Khan, commander of the Iranian Cossack Brigade, a force originally trained by Russian officers, staged a coup. By 1925, he had deposed the last Qajar Shah and declared himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of a new dynasty. Reza Shah was a modernizer in the mold of Ataturk in Turkey, forceful, authoritarian, and convinced that rapid westernization was the only path to national survival. He built roads and railways. He established secular universities. He banned traditional dress codes and ordered men to wear Western hats. He secularized the legal system and reduced the power of the clergy. His methods were often harsh. Political opposition was suppressed. Tribal leaders were forcibly settled. Critics were imprisoned. During World War II, Iran's strategic position made it a prize again. Both Britain and the Soviet Union were concerned about Reza Shah's German sympathies. In 1941, they jointly invaded and occupied Iran, forcing Reza Shah to abdicate in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The young Shah inherited a complicated country, and in the early 1950s, it became the center of one of the Cold War's most significant dramas. Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister in 1951 on a platform that centered on one demand: nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which had for decades extracted Iranian oil under terms widely seen as exploitative. The nationalization happened. The British imposed a boycott. The United States, concerned about communist influence in Iran, agreed to help Britain reverse the nationalization. In 1953, a CIA and MI6 organized coup, Operation Ajax in American parlance, Operation Boot in British, overthrew Mossadegh. He was placed under house arrest, where he would die in 1967. The Shah, who had briefly fled the country during the crisis, was restored to full power. The memory of Mossadegh and the 1953 coup remains intensely alive in Iranian political consciousness, and it significantly shaped Iranian attitudes toward the United States for decades afterward. The Shah continued to rule through the 1960s and 70s, pursuing his White Revolution, a program of land reform, industrialization, women's suffrage, and development. Iran's oil wealth, especially after the price shocks of 1973, funded a transformation of the country's infrastructure. But alongside the development ran repression. SAVAK, the Shah's secret police, was feared and hated. The pace of change alienated the clergy, who saw their influence diminishing. The leftists who had supported Mossadegh had never forgiven the coup. The poor, despite official growth statistics, felt left behind. In 1979, the pressure exploded. The Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who had spent years in exile in Iraq and France, was one of the most unexpected political events of the 20th century. Mass protests swept the country. The Shah, suffering from cancer, fled Iran in January 1979. Khomeini returned in February to a reception of millions. The Islamic Republic of Iran was established, a new form of government built around the concept of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The supreme leader would hold ultimate authority, checked only by religious credentials and, in theory, popular legitimacy. Chapter 15: The Islamic Republic. War, Isolation, and Identity. The new republic was tested almost immediately. In November 1979, a group of student revolutionaries seized the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 diplomats hostage. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days and shattered the already strained relationship between Iran and the United States. The humiliation of the failed rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, in which American helicopters crashed in the desert, further deepened the wound. Then, in September 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran. Calculating correctly that the revolutionary chaos had weakened the Iranian military, and calculating incorrectly that the war would be brief. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. It was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. Both sides suffered catastrophic casualties. Chemical weapons were used against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians. The city of Khorramshahr was taken and then retaken in some of the most intense urban fighting since World War II. Iran accepted a ceasefire in 1988, what Khomeini described as drinking from the cup of poison. He died the following year. The decades that followed were marked by complex tensions between reformists and hardliners within the system, between Iran's regional ambitions and international sanctions over its nuclear program, between a young, educated, urban population with connections to the wider world and a clerical establishment committed to its founding vision. The Green Movement of 2009, the protests of 2019 and 2022, the ongoing debates about women's rights and individual freedom. These are all expressions of a society in profound negotiation with itself between the inheritance of its revolution and the demands of its present. In 1921, a military officer named Reza Khan, commander of the Iranian Cossack Brigade, a force originally trained by Russian officers, staged a coup. By 1925, he had deposed the last Qajar Shah and declared himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of a new dynasty. Reza Shah was a modernizer in the mold of Ataturk in Turkey, forceful, authoritarian, and convinced that rapid westernization was the only path to national survival. He built roads and railways. He established secular universities. He banned traditional dress codes and ordered men to wear Western hats. He secularized the legal system and reduced the power of the clergy. His methods were often harsh. Political opposition was suppressed. Tribal leaders were forcibly settled. Critics were imprisoned. During World War II, Iran's strategic position made it a prize again. Both Britain and the Soviet Union were concerned about Reza Shah's German sympathies. In 1941, they jointly invaded and occupied Iran, forcing Reza Shah to abdicate in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The young Shah inherited a complicated country, and in the early 1950s, it became the center of one of the Cold War's most significant dramas. Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister in 1951 on a platform that centered on one demand: nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which had for decades extracted Iranian oil under terms widely seen as exploitative. The nationalization happened. The British imposed a boycott. The United States, concerned about communist influence in Iran, agreed to help Britain reverse the nationalization. In 1953, a CIA and MI6 organized coup, Operation Ajax in American parlance, Operation Boot in British, overthrew Mossadegh. He was placed under house arrest, where he would die in 1967. The Shah, who had briefly fled the country during the crisis, was restored to full power. The memory of Mossadegh and the 1953 coup remains intensely alive in Iranian political consciousness, and it significantly shaped Iranian attitudes toward the United States for decades afterward. The Shah continued to rule through the 1960s and 70s, pursuing his White Revolution, a program of land reform, industrialization, women's suffrage, and development. Iran's oil wealth, especially after the price shocks of 1973, funded a transformation of the country's infrastructure. But alongside the development ran repression. SAVAK, the Shah's secret police, was feared and hated. The pace of change alienated the clergy, who saw their influence diminishing. The leftists who had supported Mossadegh had never forgiven the coup. The poor, despite official growth statistics, felt left behind. In 1979, the pressure exploded. The Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who had spent years in exile in Iraq and France, was one of the most unexpected political events of the 20th century. Mass protests swept the country. The Shah, suffering from cancer, fled Iran in January 1979. Khomeini returned in February to a reception of millions. The Islamic Republic of Iran was established, a new form of government built around the concept of velayat-e faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The supreme leader would hold ultimate authority, checked only by religious credentials and, in theory, popular legitimacy. Chapter 16, What Remains. 5,000 years of continuous civilization. Dozens of dynasties. Conquests by Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, and Afghans. The birth and spread of Zoroastrianism. The transformation of Islam. The creation of some of humanity's greatest poetry, architecture, science, and music. What endures through all of this is not a single dynasty or religion or political system. What endures is something harder to name, a cultural continuity, a sense of identity that has proven extraordinarily resilient against every force that has tried to erase or replace it. Iranians still celebrate Nowruz, the Persian New Year, on the spring equinox, a tradition stretching back at least 3,000 years, predating Islam, predating even the Achaemenids. They still read Ferdowsi and Hafez and Rumi, poets who wrote in a language largely unchanged for 1,000 years. They still feel, in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, the weight and the honor of a very long past. The remarkable thing about Iran is not its monuments, though they are extraordinary. It is not its geography, though it is dramatic. It is the simple, stubborn fact that a civilization that first took shape when most of the world was still living in scattered villages is still here, still speaking a recognizable version of the same language, still marking the same holidays, still insisting on its own particular way of being in the world. That, perhaps, is the thing almost no one says when they talk about Iran. The survival itself is the story. Thank you for traveling through this history with us. These are the kinds of stories we love to tell. Ones that ask you to see a place with new eyes, with a little more depth, a little more wonder. If this journey stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. And if there's a place or a history you'd like us to explore, leave it in the comments. We read them. Until next time, take care of yourself.